All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Eva, and I'm one of this year's Law Women co-presidents. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the 2021 Law Women Alumna Reception. This event is an exciting one for Law Women each year. We always look forward to this time to both celebrate an alumna who has done groundbreaking work in the legal field and to come together as a community of current and former NYU law students. Though we wish we could have all connected in person this year, we're so grateful for the opportunity to continue the tradition of this event virtually. This has certainly been a challenging year. When Julia and I took on our roles as Law Women co-presidents, we pledged to continue strengthening our group's commitment to diversity, proactive advocacy, and community building. We also pledged to support those in and beyond our community through the unprecedented challenges of remote classes in the pandemic, as well as the mental and physical toll of facing increasingly urgent social and racial injustices. Now more than ever, we're striving to create programming that empowers women from all backgrounds with the resources and community they need to become leaders in the legal fields. This year, we're hosting all of our usual events and more, all in a remote format. And this includes panels on academic success and career paths, as well as events devoted to community building, mental health, and advocacy. We have continued our annual peer mentoring program, matching over 150 first-year students with upper class women mentors. Additionally, our board has set up a brand new attorney mentoring program, which in the coming months will match students with attorneys in their practice areas of interest for career guidance. To better serve our community through this especially challenging year, Law Women has also contributed to the school's COVID Relief Fund, and we have continued previous board's work of putting together an endowment fund through which Law Women can support the needs of NYU law students. We're excited to announce that the endowment is now up and running and will begin distributing annual grants to help meet the needs of our community members beginning in the fall of 2021. As part of our community building efforts, we greatly value the opportunity to create a strong network of past and present students who can learn from each other. And this event is an important part of that. Tonight, we look forward to hearing and learning from this year's alumna honoree, Ms. Susan Herman. And her remarks will surely bring up many compelling ideas, so please save your questions for a Q&A immediately afterward, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. Now, please join me in welcoming Dean Trevor Morrison.
Thanks, Eva. Good evening to all of you. It's my pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for joining us for this year's Law Women Alumni Reception. This is an important event on the annual calendar of the law school, no less important this year, in fact, more so, given the unusual circumstances we're all operating in this year. Law Women is an exceptionally important organization and part of the fabric of the law school, and its leaders every year are among our most important student leaders and graduates of the program and of the school, of course, include many greatly distinguished graduates of the law school. Law Women continues a tradition here at NYU Law of leadership when it comes to encouraging women's leadership in the law. And this is a history that we have reason to be proud of. We began admitting women here to NYU Law in 1890, which was decades before other top law schools, to be precise, 18 years before Yale, 37 years before Columbia, and 60 years before Harvard, but who's counting? We've also, of course, graduated many women's rights pioneers, from Rosalie Lowe Whitney, the class of 1895, who was the first woman lawyer to try a case before the New York Supreme Court, and the first woman attorney-in-chief of the Legal Aid Society, to Judge Judith Kaye, class of 1962, who was the first woman chief judge of the state of New York, to more recent graduates like Sherilyn Ifill of the class of 1987, the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, and Ria Tobacco Marr, class of 2008, who's now the director of the ACLU Women's Rights Project, and of course, many others as well. We are both inspired by and very proud of them and of their connection to the law school, just as we are inspired by and very proud of the current leaders of Law Women. So thank you both to Eva and to her co-chair, Julia Bruce, who will now introduce this year's honoree, Professor Herman. We're very grateful that she's accepted this year's honor and look forward to hearing from her. So thank you, and I'll turn things to Julia.
Thank you, Dean Morrison, and thank you to everyone for attending tonight's event. As Eva mentioned, we are so excited that you all have joined us to virtually celebrate, hear about our honorees' inspiring career and work, and engage in a dialogue. It is my honor to present our 2021 Alumna of the Year Award to Susan Herman. Our choice to honor Ms. Herman's work comes at a historic time. In the last month, a new administration has taken office, including our first ever woman, Black, and South Asian American Vice President. It is a moment where we have much to look forward to, but it is also a moment in which we reflect on the intense attacks on our democracy. The recent attempts to subvert the results of the presidential election are a reminder that we must work together to safeguard our democratic institutions and advance civil rights in this country. Women like Ms. Herman, who have not only dedicated their careers to promoting justice and liberty, but are national leaders of these efforts, inspire us to continue working for a better, more equal tomorrow. It is for all these reasons and more that Law Women selected Susan Herman as our honoree this year. Ms. Herman served as the president of the American Civil Liberties Union for a critical period of time over the last 13 years. Her work with the ACLU began when she was an intern during law school, and she was also on the board of the ACLU for 20 years before she was elected its president. During her tenure as president, the ACLU advanced civil rights in momentous ways. The 2015 Supreme Court case Obergefell v. Hodges was a major victory, guaranteeing same-sex couples the right to marry under the due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment. Ms. Herman also contributed amicus briefs for other significant cases that affirmed individual liberties, such as Riley v. California, in which the Supreme Court unanimously held in 2014 that warrantless search and seizure of the digital information on a cell phone is unconstitutional. In the face of xenophobic and discriminatory policies from the Trump administration, the ACLU's response was, "We'll see you in court." And they followed through. Over the last 4 years under Ms. Herman's leadership, the ACLU filed over 400 lawsuits in order to protect voting rights, advocate for immigrant rights, and promote racial justice, among other causes. Ms. Herman is also the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Professor of Law at Brooklyn Law School, where she has taught since 1980. She teaches constitutional law and criminal procedure and leads classes on topics including terrorism and civil liberties. In this role, she has helped to train the next generation of lawyers and encourage students to explore difficult issues in the law. Ms. Herman's distinguished career and the crucial work she has engaged in inspires us, and it is my honor to present her with this year's Alumna of the Year Award on behalf of Law Women.
Thank you so much, Julia and Eva and Dean Morrison and everyone else who's been involved in planning this event. Now, if we were together, we'd be doing a photo op right about now where we would all be together and we'd be taking a picture of me holding this, which is the lovely, I don't know if you can see it, it's very clear and transparent, the lovely award that I got in a very large Tiffany's box. And I want to tell you that coincidentally enough, when I received this award on Friday, January 30th, I was at that time chairing my last ACLU board meetings, and my doorbell was also ringing because I was getting from the ACLU flowers and champagne and a haka lei from a board member from Hawaii. So I am feeling extremely well appreciated, even though we can only be meeting remotely here. Now, Julia was just saying that the ACLU has been extremely busy during the last 4 years. And she was also saying that I was elected president in October 2008. So my tenure as ACLU president exactly coincided with 2 terms of Barack Obama and 1 term of Donald Trump. I think we stopped our clock at 413. Julia said that we had brought over 400 actions against the Trump administration on matters ranging from the Muslim ban to the barbaric family separation policies etc. You right down to the attacks on the rule of law itself. And I like to say that the ACLU works in 14 different areas of civil rights and civil liberties, and so did the Trump administration, just on the opposite side. So our staff really did remarkable work under the leadership of Executive Director Anthony Romero. And as of about a year ago, in addition to everything that the staff was litigating about the federal government policies, as well as in our affiliates in every state around the country, we also had the pandemic hit. And at that point, the ACLU staff was also litigating, we've litigated now over 100 cases about pandemic-related civil liberties crises, ranging from the election, how do you have a fair election during a pandemic, to litigation in prisons, jails, and ICE detention facilities about trying to just save lives, because people who are incarcerated can't really socially distance, and a lot of them don't really have enough soap to sing happy birthday even once. So our staff was really performing remarkable feats while working remotely, some of them juggling a toddler and a cat at the same time. Then came the murder of George Floyd and a moment of reckoning for racial justice. And then came the amazing events that we were, I'm sure, all watching on television today surrounding the election and the aftermath. So as Julia was saying, with the inauguration of the Biden and Harris team, the world certainly does look different. And I think that it's probably fair to say that Joe Biden is the first self-proclaimed member of the ACLU to ever be president. So nevertheless, I think the ACLU is not ready to close shop, because the civil liberties crisis is going to continue. In many states around the country, the states are redoubling their effort to try to keep the vote white and mount more voter suppression techniques to deny women reproductive freedom, to prevent trans people from using the bathroom. So as much as the Biden administration may change some policies and now be our ally in some lawsuits that we are bringing on voting rights, et cetera, I think it's inevitable that at some point the ACLU will also sue President Biden, because our staff believes that we have sued every president in the 101 years of our existence, having been founded in 1920. So, I thought I would begin the evening by answering a question that somebody who I believe is here tonight pre-submitted. My classmate Wayne Outen, who was always ahead of the curve, pre-submitted a question, and his question was, what factors influenced you to become a civil liberties leader? So that's a question people often ask me is, why the ACLU? So I want to tell you three different stories in answer to Wayne's question, and I'm going to share my screen so that I can share some pictures. I have it on regular view, but Joe, the IT person, was going to tell me if we need to go to whole screen to do this. So I'm going to start with something that happened when I was in the 3rd grade, and that's what I looked like when I was in the 3rd grade. And I was going to a public elementary school, and our principal really liked student theatrics. So every year we would do at least one play, and the play that year was the story of Johnny Tremain, which some of you may know, a story about a boy during the American Revolution. Well, I thought the play was interesting, but play doesn't have as many words as the book, and I knew that the play was based on a story, so I went to the school library to check out the Johnny Tremain book, and I was told by the librarian that I wasn't allowed to take out that book because it was in the boys section. Now, I knew there was a girls section and a boys section because I had been reading all the books in the girls section, which were collections of fairy tales, biographies of presidents' wives, and the occasional biography of Clara Barton or Florence Nightingale. But it had never occurred to me that I wasn't allowed to take books out of the boys section. So I went home at the end of that day and I told my mother, that's what my mother looked like at the time, that I wasn't allowed to take books out of the boys section, and steam came out of her ears. She was furious that the school was telling me what I should read and therefore who I could plan to become. So she called the school librarian the next day, and I was told that I could take out any book I wanted, as long as my mother didn't call again. And I was also told just a little bit later that the school changed its policy. So I think that our values are formed when we're very young. So that's a story that I often think of when people say, well, how did you become a civil libertarian? Factor number one, I think, in my becoming a civil libertarian was my mother and who I was raised to be. Factor number two, and I'm not saying this, Dean Morrison, just because you'll be pleased, but factor number two in my becoming a civil liberties leader was NYU Law School. Norman Dorson taught me constitutional law. He also taught me the ACLU. Norman was the president of the ACLU when I first joined the board. And he was the person who I looked to. After I became president, Norman and I would have dinner quite regularly. And if you know Norman, you know it was always at the best restaurants. And he would give me really great advice about what was going on. So the fact that Norman was at the law school was, I think, a major influence on my career. And you all know that Norman has also influenced many other students at NYU because he founded the Arthur Garfield Hayes Civil Liberties Program, named for the ACLU's first general counsel. And Sylvia Law and Helen Hirschkopf, who I think may be here, although I can't see them, are now the co-directors of that program. So Helen was pointing out to me the other day that connections between NYU and the ACLU are even more numerous than that. Helen had actually worked for the ACLU before she joined the faculty at NYU Law School, a path also taken by Bert Newborn. And I think I'll mention a couple of other people later on who also connected the NYU Law School and the civil liberties world for me. But again, that list could go on for a very long time. Even though there are very many connections, there's one more connection that I want to mention to you. So here's another interesting bit of history. In 100 years, I was only the 7th president of the ACLU. The first 2 presidents of the ACLU, these 2 gentlemen, were ministers, and I am the 3rd of a string of 4 law professors, basically more or less constitutional law professors from New York, to be president. I wasn't the first woman. Nadine Strossen was the first woman, and she was the president right before me. And I'm sure that many of you know that the 8th president, who was just elected less than 2 weeks ago, the same day I was getting the champagne and flowers, is Deborah Archer. So I'm sorry that we can't all look at Deborah, in her tiny box on the screen instead of in this picture. But Deborah, I think, will do proud the NYU tradition and that Norman Dorson began of this connection. So that's my kind of second answer, the second factor to what contributed to my being a civil liberties leader. The next factor that I want to talk about is the ACLU itself, the nature of the ACLU. And the students who organized this event asked if I would talk about women and social movements, and also asked me to talk about intersectionality. And fortunately, both of those themes are themes that to me are really part of the story of the ACLU. Most people would tell you that the ACLU was founded by Roger Baldwin, who was the first director for 30 years. And I learned in high school, one of the quotes I learned from Ralph Waldo Emerson is that an institution is but the lengthened shadow of one man. Well, when it was coming time for the ACLU centennial in 2020, I became interested in doing some more research into the women who were around in 1920, who were also part of the founding of the ACLU, which, as you note, of course, was the same year that women finally got the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. And Crystal Eastman, in this collage here, it was somebody who was also always named as one of the founders of the ACLU, but I never really knew what the story was. So when I set out to research Crystal, I learned some extremely interesting things. So the first thing that I want to tell you, Dean Morrison was just saying that NYU admitted women as of 1890. Well, Crystal Eastman was a graduate of NYU Law School in 1907, and she was second in her class. And when she went to apply for jobs in the law, she was really looking forward to practicing law, but she couldn't get a job in the law. Guess why? She was a woman. So Crystal went on to Plan B, and she went to work with a commission that was studying industrial accidents and the relationship of workers' accidents and the law. Now, there's a really interesting story where if you want to talk about tangents during the Q&A, it would be a tangent for now, but there are fascinating stories around Crystal's Plan B, because within just a few years, she had revolutionized the law about workers' accidents in the United States and went on to draft the first state law in New York State providing workers' compensation. So that's one really interesting issue about the law, and a way in which she managed to have an enormous impact on the law, even though the law would not accept her as somebody who should be practicing. What I do want to, the other thing that I should say is if we don't get back to Crystal, I have asked Joe, who is being very helpful on IT, to post a link in the chat to the blog piece that I wrote for the ACLU 100 series. And this is the illustration at the beginning of that, which tells the story of Crystal Eastman. Because it turns out that Crystal Eastman was the person who dreamed up the idea of the ACLU. Now, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were a number of women who, like Crystal, were tremendous activists, and they were very involved in organizations, running organizations. They were suffragists. Crystal was a suffragist. She was a pacifist. She was a socialist. She was into the labor movement. She was an internationalist. And she and a number of other women, I think, became adept at organizations because they didn't have political power. Most women in the country could not, at the time that they were being activists before 1920, couldn't even vote. So one of the organizations that Crystal ran, that she was the director of, was called the American Union Against Militarism. And what the AUAM did was that they tried to prevent World War I, didn't work out so well. They tried to prevent the draft. They tried to prevent military preparedness. And this is a parade that they had down Fifth Avenue in Greenwich Village, which starred Jingo the paper mache dinosaur. And I think the one message here is that if you don't have political power, you have to be really creative in organizing if you're going to hope to make a difference to the world. So in addition to running the AUAM and a whole list of other pacifist and suffragist organizations, Crystal and her brother Max Eastman also they published The Masses, which was a left-wing magazine of arts and politics that was also a very ardent anti-war platform. So when in 1917, when the United States entered World War I, it became really impossible to speak out, to really vocally be against the war or against the draft or against the form of government. And going back to Max for a minute, Max Eastman and a number of his colleagues were prosecuted for sedition, which was a World War I era statute, which prevented demoralizing the troops and saying things that were considered unpatriotic. So at that point, it was really dangerous to just speak out against the war. So Crystal, as the head of the American Union Against Militarism, pivoted. And what she decided to do, she decided that the best thing that the AUAM could do would be to start a National Civil Liberties Bureau. So you can see here at the bottom, this is an announcement of a mass meeting of the National Civil Liberties Bureau. And her idea was that instead of just speaking to the result of we're against the war, that the National Civil Liberties Bureau could represent conscientious objectors and could represent people who were anti-war and who wanted to speak out against the war, against the draft, on the principle that it violated their civil liberties to criminally prosecute them for expressing their own beliefs, even if their beliefs were unpopular. Now, at the time, this was not a subject that was got anywhere in the courts. The courts were not willing at the time to protect the First Amendment. So the idea that we have today that you can go to court and get them to dismiss a prosecution that's on the basis of you said something unpopular is an idea that only developed during the 20th century, in large measure because of litigation that was done by the ACLU. Well, so Crystal was the director, and in 1917, when the National Civil Liberties Bureau was about to be launched, Crystal, who actually had a long history of ill health, was also very pregnant. So in the spring of 1917, she ended up taking a maternity leave, and the AUAM brought in Roger Baldwin to take over as director. And Roger Baldwin then went on to become the director at the National Civil Liberties Bureau. And then when the ACLU sprang from that, he became the founding director of the ACLU, where he was founding director from 1920 until 1950. So what about Crystal? Where did that leave her? One of the gifts that my colleagues at the ACLU got for me, because they knew I was so interested in this history, is they found this beautiful photograph of a young Roger Baldwin and a young Crystal Eastman. Now, to me, this photograph is full of mystery, because one thing that I have never been able to really find out to my satisfaction is what the relationship between Roger Baldwin and Crystal Eastman actually was. There is a letter that survives that she wrote to her board chair at the AUAM to say, well, I am about to have a baby, but you don't really need to bring anybody in to replace me because my assistant could keep things going and then I could come back. Now, One reason that we don't know all that much about Crystal, I didn't at the time know a lot about Crystal Eastman, was that as of about a little over a year ago, year and a half, there was no full-length biography that had been published of Crystal Eastman. So one of the chief sources of information that I had was several articles written by Sylvia Law, who had done a lot of research on Crystal Eastman, including one article that was called Crystal Eastman, NYU Graduate. So Crystal ended up, taking a back seat. She came back to work in 1917, very shortly after her son was born. But at that point, her role was really diminished. She was no longer the director. And after 1920, when the ACLU was founded, that's the first logo here, Crystal was on the executive committee for a while, but as I read the archives, she didn't actually have that much role in the early ACLU. She'd make a comment from time to time. And in 1921, she just stepped away. And the story was that she stepped away because of ill health. But haven't we learned to wonder about stories like that, where a woman is marginalized and kind of ends up not having the organization be her organization anymore? As I was saying, Crystal was very active in suffrage as well as in pacifism. And here she is with Alice Paul sewing a banner, because we worked very hard with Alice Paul to try to promote the 19th Amendment. So in 1920, the same year when the ACLU was founded and the 19th Amendment was adopted, most of the women's groups were celebrating. I say most, and I don't know if I could really quantify that, but many women's groups were celebrating that women finally had gotten the right to vote. Crystal was not celebrating. Crystal wrote a very famous speech. It was both a speech and an article called "Now We Can Begin." American Rhetoric still lists this on their list of 100 greatest American speeches of all time. And Crystal's point was that getting the vote was not enough, that women should use their newfound political power to fight for equal rights. Well, Crystal was not the only one sort of connecting the women's suffrage movement with the ACLU. Here are other women who were part of the founding committee. Jeannette Rankin was the first woman elected to Congress. She was also the ACLU's first vice president. Jane Addams, Helen Keller. So the ACLU was always an organization of women as well as men. However, the women, Roger Baldwin said, the women kept the ACLU alive in the early years by serving on all the committees and raising the funds. But who was on the ACLU staff? Well, Roger Baldwin was the executive director, and the first general counsel was a man, a very great man, Arthur Garfield Hayes. And there's Hayes doing something that both he and Roger Baldwin liked to do, which was to make a point that the First Amendment should allow people to demonstrate. They would hold demonstrations that they weren't supposed to be having, and then they would do things like read the First Amendment out and just provoke their arrests on the ground of that they had been reading the First Amendment. So this is a bust of Arthur Garfield Hayes that sat in the conference room in which I have attended very many ACLU meetings. So there's a very great lawyer behind the name of the Arthur Garfield Hayes Civil Liberties Program. And one of the things that Hayes did, which is another tangent, but I will ask Joe to also put the link to this in the chat, is Hayes represented this woman, Rosika Schwimmer, who became a client of the ACLU on more than one occasion. And one of the problems that she was having was that she was a Hungarian who was also a suffragist and a pacifist. And she at one point after emigrated to the United States and was denied citizenship on the ground that she was a pacifist. So that's another really interesting chapter. If people want to talk more about that in Q&A, we can do that. But in any event, you can also read the blog post on Rosika Schwimmer if you want. And there are, again, fascinating stories just along the way about Arthur Garfield Hayes and Rosika Schwimmer, and not only who was connected with the ACLU from the inside, but who the ACLU was representing. And Rosika Schwimmer, as a Hungarian Jewish pacifist fighting for women's rights, was like a magnet for all the xenophobic forces of the 1920s. Well, I want to tell you, sort of beginning to wrap up the story of Crystal Eastman, that Crystal now does have a full biography, was published about a little over a year ago by Amy Aronson. It's an excellent book if you want to know more about Crystal. And Amy Aronson and I did what I think was a very interesting program for village preservation, which was a kind of walking tour of the village and all the sites that were connected with the ACLU. So if you're interested in that, if I could ask Joe to also put that link in the chat, that's something else that you can do, since walking tours are these days easier online than they are in person. Well, Crystal Eastman, given her idea in 1920, now we can begin. She was very much in favor of arguing for women's equality, not just women's right to vote. And she is credited for having co-drafted with Alice Paul the Equal Rights Amendment. So I have to tell you that the ACLU at the beginning did not support the Equal Rights Amendment, because the women who were advising the ACLU at the time didn't agree with Crystal, and they were concerned that adoption of the ERA might lead to the demise of protectionist laws, that were kind of favoring women. Crystal said, protectionism is often just another form of tyranny, but they were afraid to lose those protectionist laws. And so for a long time, the ACLU was not supporting the ERA until this woman came along, Dorothy Kenyon, another NYU law graduate. Dorothy was on the board of the ACLU from 1930 until her death in 1972. And at the point at which Dorothy Kenyon changed her mind and decided the ERA should be supported, the ACLU started supporting the ERA. Dorothy Kenyon was also one of the main reasons why the ACLU got involved in lobbying for the Equal Pay Act. And when she was joined on the board by Pauli Murray, another great civil rights activist who's never who hadn't gotten her due in history until quite recently, they really were pressing the ACLU to become more active in the area of women's rights. Now, I was saying before that Crystal Eastman and the other women, these organizing women, were very much intersectionalists before the term was coined. They understood the connections between sexism, racism, poverty, jingoism. And Blanche Wiesen-Cook, who published a collection of Crystal's papers, said that she thinks that the reason that history basically forgot about Crystal for decades, many decades, was that it was too challenging. She said, history tends to suppress what it finds too threatening, and Crystal was threatening because she drew those connections. Pauli Murray is also somebody who was very much an intersectionalist. She used to talk about Jane Crow, not just Jim Crow, but the special problems that women had because of slavery and its aftermath. So if those faces were not familiar to you, I finally have a woman who actually needs no introduction at all. So thanks in part to the efforts of Dorothy Kenyon and Pauli Murray, the ACLU did agree to found a women's rights project, co-founded by RBG herself. And the first brief that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, before she was justice, submitted to the Supreme Court in the Reed v. Reed case, I think this is quite wonderful. She put on the cover of the brief the names of Dorothy Kenyon and Pauli Murray. They hadn't actually worked on the brief, but she wanted to acknowledge that her work was really standing on the shoulders of these women. Ruth Bader Ginsburg's impact very much, that's another tangential story, very much survives at the ACLU today. This is Louise Melling, who I think is also here, although I can't see you, Louise, hi, who is now the Deputy Legal Director and Director of the Ruth Bader Ginsburg Center for Liberty, one of 3 centers at the ACLU, which, as you can see, encompasses the ACLU's work on reproductive freedom, women's rights, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender rights, freedom of religion, and belief and disability rights. And here are the other 2 centers. As I was saying, the ACLU works in these 14 different areas, and there they all are. And as you've also heard mentioned, the current director of the Women's Rights Project, called by another head of the Women's Rights Project, referred to it as the house that Ruth built, for you baseball fans. But Ria Tupac Amar is now the director of the Women's Rights Project. Ria may be here too. Hi, Ria. And she moved to that position from having been a senior staff attorney with the ACLU's LGBT project. So here is Ria with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I also want to tell you that when I was elected president of the ACLU in October 2008, I got a lovely note from Justice Ginsburg, justice at that time, on Supreme Court stationery congratulating me and telling me that she was glad that my steady hand was at the helm. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg's influence persists, and I think that Crystal Eastman would like the organization that the ACLU is today. Unlike the early years where there were no women really on staff, the ACLU staff, the ACLU and national staff, as well as the affiliate staffs, are now about 50% women. You don't need the exact figures. I was just looking for the exact figures. But in the affiliates, about half of our affiliate executive directors are women. And the early people of the ACLU also tended to be all white, and that is no longer the case. I can tell you that our board of directors at this point is 60% people who identify as not white. So every time I look at my signature line on my email signature, Julia was kind enough to note my chair as Ruth Bader Ginsburg Professor of Law. Every time I look at my email signature, I get inspiration. So there's one more story that I could tell you about my connection with NYU, but I think what I'd like to do, because this is the time that we had thought that we might turn to the Q&A, is I think I'll leave it to Julia and Eva, whether or not you would like to hear my story about the Bell-Terre case, which is something I worked on as a student at NYU, which could be fun to hear about, or whether they would rather get to other kinds of questions. So thank you all for the award and for being here. And I look forward to seeing what else Julia and Eva would like to talk about.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ms. Herman, for sharing some of your personal experiences and insights. That was fascinating, and I know that people want to hear more from you. So I think we can just jump into our Q&A and do a few questions, and then maybe at the end, if there's a couple of minutes left, you could share your story, if that works.
Okay.
Great. All right, so if anyone in the audience has a question, you can write it in using the Q&A function on Zoom. That should just be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And while people are taking a minute to write in their questions, we can get started with a few questions that were submitted in advance. All right, so the first question we got was, what do you see as the biggest hurdles that the ACLU has to overcome to effectively affect change?
Okay, great question. So I think one hurdle that I would mention, because it's just a fact of what's happened during the past 4 years, is that, as I was saying, in 1920, when the ACLU started, the courts they weren't that helpful in implementing civil liberties. They weren't really willing to recognize the First Amendment as a reason why the government shouldn't be able to prosecute somebody for saying something unpopular. Well, the ACLU lately has taken to use in the courts a fair amount, because that law had developed. But now that President Trump has appointed 245, I think the number is, of federal judges, I think we can anticipate that the federal courts are going to be a more difficult place to win. For anyone who's interested in that question, our wonderful legal director, David Cole, has written a piece in the New York Review of Books in which he says that he thinks that the situation in the Supreme Court might not be quite as dire as some people are predicting. But that's the optimistic view. So I think that one challenge for the ACLU is going to be to kind of get back to our roots. One route, of course, is to think more about state courts. And that's a place where we've been doing a lot of litigating. Julia mentioned the Obergefell case, which was a case in which the Supreme Court held that people do have the right to marry somebody, even if they're of the same sex. But that case was preceded by decades of work in the states, in the state courts and the state legislatures, really building the groundwork for the Obergefell case. So I think that our work in the states becomes increasingly important, and in state courts, as the Supreme Court is, at least the composition has changed, let me say, recently. And I think the ACLU will also be looking to some of the techniques that were used early on. Maybe we'll have more parades with Jingo the dinosaur, or more organizing, more public education. And that brings me to the second answer to the question about hurdles. I think the greatest hurdle to civil liberties right now is the greatest hurdle to many other things in the country, which is hyperpartisanship. The ACLU has always been nonpartisan. We have always prided ourselves on having Republican members. We still have Republican members, and a survey that people answered questions about members answered questions about their political affiliations, and that showed that we have members who voted for Donald Trump. So in fact, we've always prided ourselves on being able to work with across the aisle with whoever. So when the Republicans in Wisconsin did gerrymandering to try to preserve the advantage for Republican incumbents, we challenged that. And when the Democrats in Maryland did the same kind of thing, we challenged that. But during the Trump years, it became difficult to even know what nonpartisanship meant. And one of the problems that I think we have is that it is increasingly difficult to reach across the aisle. And that's not because we have moved, it's because the Republican Party has moved. And so I think the whole idea of trying to find our common ground. I gave a talk recently in Arkansas at the Central Arkansas Library where I wanted to talk about the ACLU and nonpartisanship. And I called it "A Republican and a Democrat Walk into a Bar." And my feeling is, if we can't agree on our fundamental values, at least, if we could agree on the facts, how the fundamental values should apply, then I think our democracy is really in danger. So I see the problem that there are areas where we still have bipartisan cooperation, and one of our top priorities is criminal justice reform. One of our goals has been to reduce mass incarceration by 50%. And there are a lot of Republicans who also are willing to think a lot about criminal justice reform. So anyway, I think the hyperpartisanship is really a fundamental problem.
Thank you. Another question we got is, in what ways do you think, the current circumstances, COVID, the Trump presidency, how have they permanently changed the field of law?
Oh, yeah. Well, at the moment, the answer is pretty obvious. We're all in little boxes on the screen instead of, being able to do things live together. So there have been tremendous challenges that we hope are only temporary to, how do you have a jury trial on Zoom? But long term, I think that because I think a lot about the Constitution instead of answering about law generally, I think there's going to be a lot of fallout in terms of insurance law and bankruptcy law and real estate. But I think about the impact of COVID on the Constitution. And so one more link, if Joe would be kind enough to put it up, is I did a talk for the Brooklyn Public Library recently that I called COVID-19 and the Constitution. And my premise was that disease exposes and exploits underlying vulnerabilities, and that is true for society as it is for individual people. So I think that the Constitution has been very much challenged by the pandemic, both in terms of voting rights, and in some ways, the Constitution has really been very important during these uncertain times. I was mentioning at the beginning that the ACLU has done a lot of litigation, trying to keep people in prisons and jails and ICE detention safe. Well, one reason why that has been possible is because of the Eighth Amendment and some parallel provisions that prohibit cruel and unusual punishment. So the Constitution has been really important in this time. But to me, the pandemic, in addition to other things recently happening, also show that our Constitution has some real vulnerabilities. And to me, one of those vulnerabilities is that the Constitution has never been interpreted as recognizing any affirmative rights. It's only considered to be, almost always negative prohibitions on the government instead of affirmative rights to have the government do something to care for people. So I think that what I would like to see, I'd like to see a conversation start about our fundamental values. That's not only about what we have in the current Constitution, but about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which many countries other than the United States adopt. And it is a much broader view about what fundamental values should be in a society. Most people in this country have never heard of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but a small anecdote. So I was invited to Dublin a couple of years ago for the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And there it was a really big deal. They couldn't believe that not every American studied it in school. And I got to be part of a ceremony of taking turns reading out the Declaration of Human Rights from the steps of the City Hall in Dublin, alternating with the Lord Mayor of Dublin. And it was just a really big deal. Now, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was mostly a brainchild of Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the one who started that project. And Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt thought that that would be our next frontier of development, to move from a country that only says the government can't to a country that says the government should. And I think that's a debate that we're very much having because of the pandemic, because it turns out that even though there are people in this country who are anti-maskers and who don't think that they should be able to be forced to socially distance, a very sizable majority of people in this country would prefer to take care of each other rather than having their own total freedom to do whatever they want. So to me, the really fundamental possibilities of our discussions during and after the pandemic are really about what kind of society we'd like to be, not just the changes to individual laws, but just kind of reframing our entire view of what it means to be an American and what the Constitution and our fundamental values should be.
Great, thank you. And as a woman with a very long and successful career, a lot of people were just curious to hear more about your perspective on things like, what do you think are the greatest difficulties facing women in the law today? And what advice would you give for women who are beginning their legal careers?
Well, okay, greatest difficulties. Well, nothing like what Crystal Eastman faced, nothing like what Ruth Bader Ginsburg faced. Nothing like Sandra Day O'Connor, all those women who were brilliant people, they graduated from law school and they could not get a job as a lawyer. So, things are better. Nevertheless, I think one of the problems that women face, and this gets back to my point about lack of affirmative rights, is that women often tend to have more family responsibilities for children or for people in their family who need care. And without adequate provision for childcare, for real, family health leaves and things like that, I think it continues to be very difficult for working women, to also take care of their families. So I think that's just a problem that again should be addressed by just looking at how our structural inequality. How are we structuring things so that life is more difficult for women? In terms of advice, I think that the Crystal Eastman and Ruth Bader Ginsburg stories are both examples of paths are many. The Buddhists say that paths are many. So Crystal couldn't become a lawyer, so she ended up changing the law in really profound ways in this country. Ruth Bader Ginsburg couldn't get a job as a lawyer, so she became a law professor and ended up doing some pretty great things. So I'll tell you, after I graduated from law school, I had a clerkship. And then I applied for a job at the New York Civil Liberties Union. And I will share with you that I didn't get the job because the person who got the job was Steve Shapiro, who was a pretty good choice. And he ended up becoming the legal director of the ACLU for a number of years. But I ended up just finding a different path, being a lay leader and being on the board and also teaching. So I think that the whole idea, I talked to a lot of law students who would love to work for the ACLU. And unfortunately, not everybody can. There are not enough funds in the world for that. So I think people who want to do that kind of work can find many opportunities to do it. And even if it's not at your job, there are bar associations, there are volunteer opportunities, pro bono opportunities, there are communities that really need assistance. So I think if you keep your eyes on the goal as opposed to the formal packages, I think that my advice to women is seize your opportunities. And should I tell my Belterre story now, or because I think this may be an example of that?
Yeah, that would be perfect.
Okay, so when I was in my first year at law school, this is my first connection with the ACLU itself. Larry Sager, who was my property professor, asked if any students wanted to volunteer to help the ACLU by doing a project studying several Supreme Court justices who were kind of the swing justices. And the idea was that if you read a bunch of their opinions, maybe you could figure out what kinds of arguments might appeal to them so that the ACLU could go there and win more cases. So I was researching Potter Stewart, which was it was a lot more cumbersome in those pre-internet days. And so one day I went into Larry's office to report on my research. And we talked for a while, and he offered me a job as his research assistant over the summer to work on an article that he was writing about equal protection. It turned out to be a really groundbreaking article. But while we were working on that during the summer, he said to me, famous last words, he said, could you just take a few hours off of your research to do a little research into these grouper ordinances? Because he was counsel to the New York Civil Liberties Union, and some students who were Stony Brook, graduate students had contacted the NYCLU because they were living in a village called Belterre, and they had just discovered that there was a zoning ordinance that made them illegal residents. The entire village was zoned for single-family homes, and family was defined as no more than 2 persons unrelated by blood, marriage, or adoption. So 6 graduate students were not allowed to live in Belterre, period. They had found out about this because summer was coming and they had applied for their residence-only beach permit. And they were told they couldn't have a residence-only beach permit because they weren't legal residents. So I was beginning to research this, and then the students called, again, very alarmed because they had received a criminal summons. So it turns out that in New York, violating a zoning ordinance is disorderly conduct. And every day you violate, at least it was at the time, every day you violate the ordinance is considered a separate count. So these students were facing, zillions of dollars in fines and years in prison, and they were pretty terrified. So at this point, there was this pending proceeding. And so Larry had been thinking about whether to bring a lawsuit to challenge the constitutionality of this grouper ordinance. But while this proceeding was pending, you really couldn't do that procedurally. So we were considering the criminal summons was answerable to the village justice of the peace in Belterre. So we were considering, you go into the village justice of the peace and start making your constitutional arguments. So I found, amazingly enough, doing some research, I found a 1932 New York Court of Appeals case that said that before a prosecution can be brought for a violation of a zoning ordinance, there has to be 48 hours of notice. You have to serve the notice of violation, and then you can only start the prosecution 48 hours later. Well, they hadn't done that. So Larry called up the village attorney for Belterre, and he said, well, I guess we'll see you guys at the justice of the peace, but I don't know how you're going to plan to proceed because the building inspector had never served notice. And the village attorney said, And so then next thing we knew, hours later, the criminal prosecution had been withdrawn and the notice of violation had been served. So obviously in 48 hours, these students were going to be prosecuted. But in the meantime, we got to file a complaint in federal court. So Larry wrote a 13-page complaint in a lot less than 48 hours, and I did a memorandum of law about freedom of association, et cetera. And we asked for a temporary restraining order. We got Judge John Dooling, who was a lovely man, even though he ruled against us. And we go into his chambers, and we're meeting with him. He gets the village attorney on the phone, and everybody explains to him what's happening. And he said, well, I'm inclined to grant this temporary restraining order, but would you mind if I made one change? He said. We said, well, what's that? He said, would you mind, it is summer. Wouldn't your clients like to go to the beach while the case is pending? Can I write that in? And we said, why, that would be all right. So he hand writes into our TRO draft, and they have to be allowed to go to the beach. So then I, as the junior member of the team, was sent out to Belterre to meet the clients and tell them what was going on. And then they took me on a little tour of the area. So I showed them the federal court order, and I explained that they now had a right to go to the beach. And we were driving around the neighborhood so that they could show me everything, including the famous residents-only beach. So no sooner had their tires hit the parking lot than this very large man comes striding across the parking lot and says, what are you doing here? You're not allowed to be here. So they all look at me. And I'm thinking, what am I, a not very large law student, supposed to do about this large man who doesn't want us in his parking lot? And then I thought, well, I actually have a federal court order right here in my bag. So I got out of the car and kind of drew myself up and said, I'm with the New York Civil Liberties Union, kind of, and I have here a federal court order that says that these students are allowed to go to this beach. So guy looks at me, I still remember his name. The guy looks at me, he looks at the federal court order, and he melted. And I thought, this is cool, I want to do this. So there's one of my Belterre stories, but that's where I think that is part of advice, because I stumbled into that. I volunteered to work on this project. I got to know my law professor, I got involved, and that case turned out to be really a major part of my legal education. So there's a longer answer than you thought, but I just think it's a good story.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you for sharing that story with us. So we only have about a minute left for the Q&A. So I think I'll just close it out by asking you something that a lot of people are wondering, actually, which is, now that you're stepping down as ACLU president, what's next?
What's next? Well, I still get to be Ruth Bader Ginsburg Professor of Law. So this is all very new to me, only having one job. And so, I'm going to have to see what's next. But part of what I think might be next, and I shouldn't really say this, but I'm very interested in the history. And I've spent a lot of time in the New York Public Library archives reading about Rosika Schwimmer. Read the story on the blog. It's an amazing story. Crystal Eastman is amazing. And I feel like I want to write about these women, these women who were all in these organizations and who understood the connections that the ACLU is all about. It's not just a matter of my rights or these rights or those rights. It's all connected. Freedom and justice for all. So, I might write a book, and this is what I shouldn't say publicly, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'm thinking that actually these stories are too dramatic, and maybe I'll write a play. So you're all invited to opening night.
Well, that's great. We're all looking forward to that. Well, thank you so much for taking the time for the Q&A. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I'm sorry if we weren't able to get to your question, but now I'll pass it back over to Julia for some closing remarks.
Thank you to everyone for joining us tonight, and to the Office of Development and Alumni Relations and Kelly Spencer for organizing this event. Thank you also to Dean Morrison and the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network. And lastly, a special thank you to Susan Herman for taking the time to share your story and perspective with us. This is an unusual time with particular challenges, but we are so happy to see this community come together and are excited to hopefully be back together in person soon. So thank you all and have a great rest of your night.